All right, welcome to part 2 for the Unit 5 notes. In this video, we're going to talk about clear cutting. So, before we get into that, you got to know what clear cutting is affecting, and it is the forest. A forest is just a land dominated by trees or other woody vegetation, and sometimes used for commercial logging. Commercial timber operations are typically privately owned. 73% of them are. They're allowed to harvest in exchange for a royalty that is a percentage of revenues. So they actually pay a royalty to the owner of the land, typically the federal government, and then the government spends more money on management than it receives in royalties. So the idea here is we're essentially subsidizing logging. So the amount of money that they're getting is less than what they're using to manage the lands. So the logging industry gets kind of a benefit there. If they were being charged the full price, it would cost loggers more. So harvest practices, we have clear cutting. Clear cutting is removing all or almost all of the trees in an area. And you can see from this image, it can usually look pretty sad. So in the way a forest can grow, typically we're looking at, if you recall back from a few units ago, we talked about succession, and where you get establishment, and then you get a tending growth, a mature stand. Remember, or a stand is just the grouping of trees. A mature stand would then be clear cut, cleared, and then secondary succession would occur with another establishment. Now, some of the benefits to clear cutting is it's usually the most economical and it's easy. Usually they replant the stands, so they'll grow back. But this can show you 4 years after clear cutting in northwest Oregon of Douglas fir. Just because they replanted doesn't mean that it is regrowing very quickly. Adverse effects, of course, there's a reduction in biodiversity. The fast-growing direct sunlight species are typically favored because if you can grow fast and do well in direct sunlight, there's not going to be a lot of competition. Less valuable species may have been harvested as well, like bycatch and fishing, so that can cause some of other species to go become endangered or be removed. And of course, habitat disruption and fragmentation, just pure losing the habitat that was that forest. There's also an increase in wind erosion because the trees help prevent the wind from eroding the soil, which can obviously remove soil nutrients. This can also cause stream sedimentation as water is able to run off with more nutrients with it, bringing more soil with it because there's not as much forest and other plants to stop the water and slow the water. It can also cause mudslides, and it can lead to increased water temperatures. So this is just some of those examples of the adverse effects of clear cutting. Just to give you an idea. Now, one thing that's being done is tree plantations are being planted, and tree plantations are in place to be clear cut and then replanted. They're usually fast-growing species. They're the same species. They'll never mature into a diverse ecosystem because they'll be removed. And because they're all the same species, they're all using the same nutrients, which is going to deplete the nutrients from that soil. So over time, that soil is going to become very, very, very poor. Another method of cutting from a forest is selective cutting. So selective cutting is where you remove single trees or small amounts of trees. Typically, you allow the growth of small, young seedlings growing next to the old growth trees. Typically, the optimum growth amount is the shade-tolerant species because of the lack of sunlight to the smaller species. It does cause less erosion. There still is a loss of biodiversity, but there are a lot of drawbacks that are the same as normal clear cutting, like the roads that get in for the logging access. Now, if you remember back to the ecosystem services, forests have their own services. They contain trees that absorb pollutants, and they store carbon dioxide. And by removing the trees, we're releasing carbon dioxide, which will overall contribute to climate change. So it is important that we don't clear cut these trees, and that's why it is considered to be such a harmful practice. So that is the end of our second video. The next video is going to be all about the Green Revolution.